My friend Carla and I rented a cabin in the Smoky Mountains of Tennessee for 5 days in October, which was her idea and which I was entirely on board with because October in the Smokies is genuinely one of the most beautiful things you can experience in the eastern United States. The color on those mountains is extraordinary, and we had been talking about doing this trip for almost 2 years before we actually did it. We found the cabin through a small regional rental company rather than a big platform, a 3-bedroom log structure on about 8 acres at the end of a Forest Service road about 14 miles from the nearest town. The listing described it as offering complete privacy and total disconnection, which we both read as selling points. We arrived on a Thursday evening, later than planned because of traffic getting out of Nashville where we both lived, and by the time we had the cabin located at the end of the Forest Service road, it was already full dark. The exterior lights were on a timer, and the cabin was lit well enough to see clearly as we pulled in, and our first impression was that it was exactly what the photos had shown. A substantial log structure with a wraparound porch and the specific warm quality of interior lamp lighting that made it look welcoming against the dark October forest surrounding it. We brought our bags in and walked through the rooms and got comfortable and made dinner and opened a bottle of wine and sat on the porch for a while listening to the October night, which in the Smokies at elevation has a specific quality of sound that is different from the lower hollows, the wind through the high canopy, the specific bird calls of that ecosystem at night. We were relaxed and glad to be there, and I want to establish that clearly because everything that followed was against a baseline of genuine comfort and familiarity with the space. The first thing happened at around 10 on the first night. Carla had gone to bed early, road fatigue catching up with her, and I was still on the porch with a second glass of wine when I saw the light in the trees. Not close, maybe 150 yards up the slope behind the cabin, where the property ended and the national forest began, a single moving light, the kind produced by a headlamp or flashlight. It moved slowly through the trees for about 2 minutes and then disappeared behind a ridge. I noted it and did not think too much about it. The national forest behind the property had trails, and the trails had hikers, and hikers sometimes hiked late, particularly in October when the days were shorter and people pushed their timelines to catch the color at higher elevations. I finished my wine and went to bed. On the second night, Friday, around 11, the light was back. This time closer, maybe 100 yards from the cabin, moving laterally along the slope rather than ascending or descending. Moving parallel to the cabin for a period of time before stopping and going out. I watched from the porch until it stopped, and I watched the area after it stopped for another 10 minutes and saw nothing further. When I told Carla about it the following morning, she said it was almost certainly another hiker and that the forest trails sometimes ran near private properties, and she was probably right, and I did not argue with her. What I did do, without mentioning it to Carla, was look up the trail maps for the area on my phone that afternoon. The nearest marked trail to our property came no closer than about 300 yards on the east side. The slope behind the cabin, the slope where I had seen the light on both nights, was not adjacent to any marked trail. It was interior national forest with no established path that appeared on any map I could access. I did not tell Carla about the trail map search. Looking back, I understand why I did not tell her, which is that I did not want to worry her on a trip she had been looking forward to for 2 years, based on something that still had possible innocent explanations even without a marked trail, because people walked off trail, especially at higher elevations where the terrain was open enough to navigate without maintained paths. Saturday night was when the innocence left the situation. We had been asleep for a couple of hours when I woke up. I do not know what woke me. There was no dramatic sound, just the specific quality of surfacing from sleep with complete alertness that suggests something registered at the edge of consciousness without being loud enough to clearly identify. I lay still and listened. The cabin was quiet. The October wind in the trees outside. Normal. Then I heard footsteps on the porch. I want to be precise about what I mean. The porch ran the full width of the cabin's front face and partway along both sides. The footstep sound was on the front section, moving from one side toward the other at a walking pace, deliberate and unhurried, the specific sound of a person moving across wooden porch boards with their full weight. Not an animal, not a branch, not the structural sound of a building in temperature change. Footsteps. Someone walking on our porch at approximately 1 a.m. I got up and went to the bedroom door and listened. The footsteps had stopped. I stood at the bedroom door for what I estimate was about 2 minutes, hearing nothing. Then I went to the front window, the one in the main room that faced the porch, and looked through the glass. The porch was empty in the area, illuminated by the exterior light, which covered the center and right section clearly. The left section was darker, and I could not see it clearly from the window angle. I stood at the window for several minutes watching and saw nothing move. I went back to bed, and I'm going to be honest that I did not sleep again that night. I lay in the dark and listened to the cabin in the forest and processed what I had heard and the 2 nights of lights on the slope behind the property. And at some point before dawn, I made the decision that if I saw the light again the following night, I was going to wake Carla and we were going to leave, which was a decision I had not planned to be in a position to make on a trip we had been planning for 2 years. I did not tell Carla about the porch footsteps on Sunday morning. I told myself I was protecting her enjoyment of the trip, and I also knew I was avoiding the conversation. We spent Sunday on a day hike at lower elevation and came back to the cabin as the light was failing and made dinner, and the evening was pleasant and normal, and I began to wonder if I was in the process of convincing myself that the accumulated events were explainable individually and therefore did not constitute a pattern, which I was aware was a form of rationalization and which I was not entirely succeeding at. At 11 Sunday night, Carla said she was going to bed, and I said I would be in shortly. I sat on the porch alone. I told myself I was sitting on the porch because the night was clear and the October sky above the mountains was extraordinary, but I knew I was sitting on the porch because I was watching the tree line on the slope behind the cabin. The light appeared at 11:30. Same slope. Closer than either previous night. 70 yards at most. Moving laterally again, that parallel motion that did not correspond to ascending or descending the slope, just moving back and forth across the face of the hill at the same elevation as the cabin, visible for approximately 4 minutes before stopping and going out. I went inside and I woke Carla. I told her everything. The first night, the second night, the trail map, the footsteps on the porch, and the light I had just seen. I told her in the specific order it happened, and I watched her expression move through dismissal and uncertainty and settling into the same place mine had settled into when I looked at the trail map, the place where the comfortable explanations run out. We packed in under 20 minutes. We did not discuss it at length or argue about it. We packed and we carried everything to the car, and I did the last walkthrough of the cabin, turning off lights and locking doors and making sure windows were closed. And during that walkthrough, I found something I had not found before, in the utility room at the back of the cabin that contained the water heater and the breaker panel. A window on the back wall of the utility room that I had not checked before, overlooking the slope behind the cabin. The window was latched from the inside, which was how I found it. But the latch showed wear marks around its edges that were inconsistent with a latch that had been in the same position for the years of the cabin's use. Wear marks that suggested the latch had been operated repeatedly. I stood there with my phone flashlight, looking at the wear marks on the latch of a utility room window that faced the slope where the lights had been moving for 3 nights, and then I turned off the flashlight and finished the walkthrough and got in the car and we left. We drove the 14 miles to the nearest town and found an inn that had a room available, and we checked in and sat on the edge of the bed for a while without saying much. Carla eventually said she wanted to call the rental company in the morning and report what we had observed, and I said I would handle it. I called them the following morning and described the lights on the slope, the footsteps on the porch, and the window latch wear marks in the utility room, and gave all of it in exactly that order and waited to hear what the property manager said. She was quiet for a long moment and then asked me to confirm the window location, the utility room, back wall, facing uphill. I confirmed it. She said she would have someone go out and check the property and that she was sorry for our experience and that the cabin had not had a reported incident before. She offered a partial refund, which I accepted without pressing the point. 2 days later, she called me back and told me that the window latch had been found broken. Not worn, but broken. The mechanism itself cracked in a way that meant it was no longer functioning correctly. She said maintenance would be replacing it. She did not offer any theory about how it had gotten that way or whether someone had been accessing the cabin through it, and I did not ask because I had concluded that the answer was not something she was going to give me on a phone call about a rental property incident, and because I did not particularly want to hear the specifics confirmed. I have been in the Smokies since. Different areas, different rentals. The October color is still as extraordinary as it has always been, and I still find it worth the drive from Nashville. But I check every window in every rental property now on the first night before I go to bed, including utility rooms and storage spaces and any room I do not plan to use. And I check specifically for wear marks around latches and for any sign that a window has been used more than its position suggests it should have been. It takes about 7 minutes to do a thorough check of a standard cabin, and I have never once found anything since. But I have also never once gone to bed in a rental property without doing it, and I am not going to start. I am a 32-year-old woman who works remotely as a technical writer, and I have been doing it for the last 5 years. About 2 years ago, I decided to rent a small cabin in the mountains of Western Virginia for an extended working period, something I had been thinking about for a long time and had finally arranged the finances. The idea was simple. Cheaper rent than my city apartment, beautiful surroundings, quiet enough to focus, and the specific quality of life change that comes from spending your working days somewhere genuinely peaceful, instead of in an urban apartment with street noise and neighbors you can hear through the walls. I found the cabin through a rental listing rather than a vacation platform. It was a small structure, 1 bedroom, a kitchen and main room, a covered porch on the front, and a smaller deck on the back that faced the mountain slope above the property. The landlord was a retired couple who owned the property and who lived in the nearest town about 20 minutes down the mountain. They were warm and practical, who gave me a thorough orientation when I arrived, showing me the well pump, breaker panel, and the wood stove, along with everything I needed to know to live in a place that had some off-grid elements. Nothing about the property or the people felt wrong in any way. I want to say that clearly. The first month was exactly what I had hoped it would be. I worked well. I slept deeply. I cooked real meals and read in the evenings and sat on the front porch in the late afternoons. The mountain above the back deck was heavily forested, and I could see up the slope from the deck, and sometimes I would sit out there in the evenings watching the light change on the trees above. It was genuinely one of the better periods of my adult life. The feeling started in the 5th week. I'm going to describe it as carefully as I can because the specificity of the feeling is the most important part of what I want to convey. It was not fear exactly, not the fear you feel from a specific threat. It was closer to the feeling you get when you realize you have forgotten something important, a specific alertness, combined with the conviction that something requires your attention, except that there was nothing I could identify that required my attention. It surfaced specifically when I was on the back deck looking up the slope, and only then, and only after sunset. During the day, the slope looked like itself. After dark, looking up at it produced the feeling. I tried to identify what had changed about the slope to produce the feeling. I could not find anything. The slope at night was exactly what a forested mountain slope at night should be. Dark and present, and making the normal sounds of a living forest. Nothing visible had changed. But the feeling was insistent in a way that I had difficulty dismissing because it was not anxiety in the generalized sense I occasionally experienced and could recognize and manage. It was specific and directional. It was pointed at the slope above the back deck consistently every night. By the end of the 6th week, I had stopped going on to the back deck after sunset. I want to note that I made this decision before anything specific had happened, before I had seen or heard anything that constituted an event. I made it purely based on the feeling, which had become uncomfortable enough that I preferred the front porch after dark, where the feeling was absent. This is the part that I return to most often when I think about what happened, the fact that something in me had already drawn a conclusion about the slope before I had any evidence to support it. The first specific event happened on a Tuesday night in my 7th week. I was in the main room working late, past 10, and I had the back deck door closed but the curtain on the door's window open because I had been looking out at the slope during the day and had simply not bothered to close the curtain when the light changed. I was not looking at the door. I was looking at my screen, and in my peripheral vision, I registered a change in the darkness visible through the door window. Not a light. A change in the quality or depth of the darkness, the specific shift that happens when something that was at one depth is now at a closer depth. I looked at the door window. I saw nothing specific. The deck beyond the glass was dark, and the slope beyond the deck was dark, and nothing was visible that I could clearly identify. I closed the curtain and sat with my heart rate elevated for several minutes, and then I closed the back deck curtain every evening before it got dark from that point forward. The second event happened about 2 weeks after the first. It was a Saturday night, later, maybe 11:30. I was getting ready for bed and I heard a sound from the back deck. Not a dramatic sound. The specific sound of something making contact with the wooden deck boards. A single soft contact and then nothing. I stood in the hallway between the bedroom and the main room and listened. The cabin was quiet. The forest was making its forest sounds, nothing further from the deck. I did not go to the back door. I want to be honest that this was not a brave decision in either direction. It was simply what my body did, which was to stand in the hallway and listen for several minutes and then go back to the bedroom and get into bed. I did not sleep well that night. The following morning, I went out to the back deck and looked at its surface carefully, the way you look at a surface when you are checking for evidence of something without wanting to admit to yourself that you are checking for evidence of something. The deck boards were weathered wood and did not hold clear impressions. I found nothing I could point to and say this is evidence, and I also found nothing that made me feel confident that the previous night had been nothing. I called the rental couple that Sunday morning. I framed it as a general inquiry, asking whether there was wildlife in the area that came close to the structures at night, bears, or anything else I should know about. The woman, whose name was Doris, said there were bears in the area but that they were not typically a problem at the cabin and that she had never had a tenant report an issue with them. She asked if everything was all right and I said yes, everything was fine, I was just curious. She said to call her if I needed anything and we got off the phone. I almost called her back 4 times that day to tell her the actual version of what had been happening. I did not, because I did not know how to describe a feeling and a peripheral darkness change and a single sound on a deck without sounding like someone who was not well, which is something I was also privately wondering at the time. The actual event happened 11 days after the deck sound. It was a Wednesday, nearly midnight, and I was awake because I had been awake for most of that week's nights, in the way you are awake when sleep requires a relaxation that you cannot access. I was on the front porch. This is important. I was on the front porch, which was where the feeling was absent, where I had been spending my evenings because the front of the property faced down the mountain toward the road and felt different from the back. I heard something from the side of the cabin, from the narrow space between the cabin's east wall and the tree line that began about 15 feet from the structure. A sound of movement, deliberate and slow, moving from the back of the cabin toward the front along the east wall. I sat completely still on the porch and watched the corner of the cabin where the east wall met the front face, the corner where whatever was moving would appear if it continued. A woman came around the corner of the cabin. I want to describe what I saw as precisely as I can because the description is where the specific wrongness lives. She was a woman, adult, dressed in dark clothing, moving at a slow, deliberate pace as though she was walking somewhere she knew and had walked before. She came around the corner of the cabin and walked along the front of the structure toward the porch steps. She had not seen me yet, or did not appear to have seen me. Her attention seemed directed at the cabin itself rather than at the porch where I was sitting. She reached the porch steps and looked up and saw me. We made eye contact, and she stopped. She did not startle. That is the specific thing I want you to understand. A person who comes around the corner of a cabin at midnight and finds someone sitting on the porch has a reaction. Surprise, apology, explanation, some combination of those things. This woman stopped and looked at me with an expression that I am going to describe as neutral in a way that was not the neutrality of composure. It was the neutrality of someone who was processing information rather than responding to an unexpected situation, as though my presence was data rather than a surprise. We looked at each other for what felt much longer than it probably was. Then she said, in a completely normal conversational tone, that she was sorry to bother me and that she had the wrong place. I did not say anything. I could not make my voice work in a way I could control in that moment, so I said nothing. She turned and walked back along the front of the cabin toward the east wall corner and went around it and was gone. I sat on that porch chair for a long time after that without moving. Eventually, I went inside and locked both doors, and I did not go to sleep that night. In the morning, I called Doris and told her everything. The feeling starting in the 5th week, the back deck curtain, the sound on the deck, the woman at midnight. Doris listened to the whole account without interrupting, and when I finished, there was a pause before she spoke, and what she said was that she was going to come up to the cabin that day and that she thought I should not be alone up there right now. She came up that afternoon with her husband and we walked the property and they looked at everything. The back deck, the east wall path, the tree line. Doris's husband found something along the east wall that I had not found when I checked after the deck sound. Compressed vegetation at the tree line edge, about 20 feet from the corner. A spot where the undergrowth had been repeatedly flattened in a way that suggested a position rather than a path through. A spot where someone standing would have a clear view of both the back deck and the side of the structure. They moved me to a different property they owned that afternoon, a place in town, and they filed a report with the county sheriff about the compressed vegetation. I do not know what came of that report. I did not stay long enough to find out. What I have thought about since is the woman's expression when she found me on the porch, not startled, processing. The specific quality of someone for whom my presence on that porch was unexpected information rather than an unexpected encounter, which means she had expected the porch to be empty, which means she had some basis for that expectation, which means she had been watching the cabin long enough to know my patterns, to know that at midnight on a Wednesday I was typically not on the front porch. And the only reason I was on the front porch at midnight on a Wednesday instead of in bed was the feeling that had been keeping me awake for weeks, the feeling I had dismissed and questioned and tried to rationalize, the feeling that had been, from the beginning, pointing in the right direction.